have separated the surface and subsurface rights decades ago. That's not true in New York. I'm not in Texas talking about Texas property, I'm talking about New York property today. And I will tell you that the vast majority, 99 and 44/100%, the Ivory Silk commercial, is how real estate is transferred in New York is fee simple. Check, check. So when we're talking about, wow, that's much louder. When you're talking about setback of 200 feet, it's 200 feet from that wedge of property, that wedge of earth. It's not 200 feet from the surface so that 200 feet below ground it's okay, because that wedge of property is what is being transferred in ownership. Make sense? Follow? It's sort of a complicated topic. So when we talk about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, there's very specific guidelines in their regulations, and it's been there for decades and decades and decades. There's a 200-foot setback. That's point 1 on my handout. Okay. Point 2, title insurance. There is a caveat in the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac guidelines that say if you can get affirmative title insurance coverage, that affirmative title insurance coverage would allow you to invade that 200 feet setback. What I'm saying is that there is not any affirmative coverage. I know there are some legal counsel out there who say, well, there's an environmental endorsement called an Alta 9 in New York. The cost of that endorsement is, it's either $25 or 10% of the cost. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's very nominal. And if you look at an Alta 9 endorsement to title insurance, if you read it, it's really to replace or repair damaged trees, shrubs, things like that. It's not to take care of the full damage loss that might occur in a catastrophic issue. It's not what's considered in Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the secondary markets guideline, as affirmative coverage. That's point number 2. Number 3, one of the things that we find in appraisals to appraise property value in New York, it's probably similar all the rest of the country as well, but we'll talk about New York. An appraiser, a licensed appraiser in New York State, will go look for 3 similar properties that have sold within 1 to 5, maybe 10-mile radius in between 6 months and 1 year. And they'll compare this 3-bedroom, 1.5-bath house to 3 other 3-bedroom, 1.5-bath houses and say, what did those 3 sell for? That's probably a good indication of what this one will sell for. The unfortunate thing is, if we have a lease on any of those, it's very difficult for the appraiser, it's near impossible, for the appraiser to determine 2 things. 1, the existence of a lease. There's no easy way for an appraiser. They can't go to the multiple listing service and say, that property had a lease. They would have to do a title search, which would add huge cost to transfer of ownership in residential property, because each title search has a cost. They can't go, and even if they could do a title search, excuse me, many of the leases that are recorded are just memorandums of lease. They will be, I see somebody raising their hands for questions, and I'm okay with it most of the time, but I think we're gonna pass those cards around, I think. So 3, where was I? Memorandum of lease. Memorandum of lease just says, I, the gas company, have a lease on 123 Main Street. There's no terms or conditions, so it's very difficult to determine whether they got paid $5 an acre, $50 an acre, $500 an acre, whether they got royalties at one level or the other, so it's really difficult to determine what that impact to value is. So an appraiser could not fulfill the requirements of traditional residential financing by finding 3 similar sales if they're not sure, they can identify that all of those properties have the exact same terms on the lease. It becomes very difficult for an appraiser. It would add huge cost to the transfer of real estate, residential real estate in New York. Okay? That was point 3.
Wait.
Very limited historical data of transferring ownership in New York of properties that have drilling taking place on it. There's been drilling for a long time, but those drill platforms were really not put on residential property for the most part. You see very large vertical drills in rural areas that were not considered residential in nature in most cases. So there's really not a lot of historical data for an appraiser to go back and look at. So that's item number 4 on my list of issues that are conflicts. They get even more concerning from this point in time forward. Item number 5, and I'm trying to be sensitive to the time here, the Fannie Mae Freddie Mac mortgage document. It is the industry standard. It is, I brought one. It is 19 pages. It is in what's called plain language. And that came out, the last revision to this document was in January of 2001. So it's been around for quite a few years. Section 18 of this document is what lenders call due on sale clause. But it is really something more than just what you think on selling. And I'll read from it. Agreement about lender's rights if the property is sold or transferred. Lender may require immediate payment in full of all sums secured by the security instrument if any or all, if all or any part of the property, or if any right in the property is sold or transferred without the lender's prior written conditions. If a borrower is not a natural person, and it goes on and on and on. Basically that says that if you have a residential mortgage on your property, you have pledged that property as collateral and agreed that you would not lease that property on a permanent lease, even a temporary lease, without without the lender's prior written permission. I will tell you that that's probably not taken place very often. Many people don't know that they needed to ask their lender for permission. So they may have signed a lease because of whatever reason. And that is in technical default under the terms of the mortgage. Now, no lender in the right mind wants to consider anybody in default. But at the end of the day, you've made a pledge that you would not give away any rights, titles, or interest in that property to any other source without the prior written consent of the lender. So that's a real serious issue. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, because of that fee simple ownership, they believe that they're getting that whole core as collateral, and if you then pledge that as collateral and then give away part of it, they don't have for collateral what they thought they had. Make sense? Section 21, which is the next bullet point on my list, I think it's number 6. Section 21 of the standard Fannie Mae Freddie Mac document, which I will say that is used probably by 95% of the lenders in the country. Even if they're not selling in the secondary market, it's an industry standard document. There's probably very rare that you'll find a lender that does not use that standard document. It's been around forever. Everyone understands it. Okay? Section 21 says that there is some prohibitions to doing things that gas leases and gas drilling typically allow. I will not do anything. I'm reading right from the document now. Let me see. There are substances that are considered hazardous for purpose of this section 21. Those substances are gasoline, kerosene, other flammable or toxic petroleum products, pesticides, herbicides, volatile solvents, materials containing asbestos, and it goes on and on and on and on. I will not do anything affecting the property that violates any environmental law, and I will not allow anyone else to do so. I will not cause or permit hazardous substances, that laundry list of things that we just talked about, gas being one of them. I will not cause or permit hazardous substances to be present on the property. I will not use or store hazardous substances on the property. I will also not dispose of hazardous substances on the property or release any hazardous substances on the property, and I will not allow anyone else to do so. I don't know, for me it sounds like that's a conflict. But I'm sort of a simple fella, so. It goes on to say that we are not talking, and it says that this promises in this paragraph do not apply to the presence or use or storage on the property of small quantities of hazardous substances that are generally recognized as appropriate for normal residential use. I think what they're talking about is your gas can to fill your lawnmower, right? I think they think that's okay. What they're saying is heavy industrial use of the property is not. So that's a serious conflict with that document that most people, I would say 95% of the people in the United States have signed a document very similar to this when they have a mortgage. So that causes a problem. There is a conflict because what that lease does, the gas lease does, is gives someone else the right to dispose of, to release, to store some of the things that you've already said you would not give anybody else the right to do. And that's a conflict. Let's try to hit a couple of other points, and then I think we're about at my 30-minute limit, or 25-minute limit, and then we have a break, I think, right?
You're doing well.
I've got about 8 minutes. Traditional homeowners insurance. Well, great, because I've got a lot more to talk about. I love to talk about this. Traditional homeowners insurance is something that is required on every single mortgaged property. And Nationwide, back in July, came out with something that Elizabeth and I have been saying for the last several years, and that is that traditional homeowners insurance does not cover any gas-related issues or losses on a residential property. I've actually talked to a dozen or so companies, not local agents, because sometimes local agents may not be aware, no disrespect to them, but I've talked to the companies, and without exception, each one said there's not enough premium for the risk involved. That makes sense to me. There's just not enough premium in a homeowner's policy for the risk involved. It's not that there's a lot of losses necessarily, but when there is a loss, it's catastrophic. In your package, if you look in here, there is a couple of printouts of newspaper reporting on the press release that Nationwide gave that says, hey, we don't cover this. I've been saying it for 2 or 3 years. Elizabeth has been saying it for 2 or 3 years. It is a concern. You should be aware as homeowners that you have a level of risk that you didn't realize you had, number one, because your homeowner's policy doesn't cover it, and number two, that may very well, and it does for a lender, cause a problem because you now no longer have the homeowner's insurance to protect all those losses that the lender thought that they were going to get. It is a conflict. A couple of other things. I talked about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, FHA and VA, and when you finally add Fannie, Freddie, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, VA all together, they do about 90% of the mortgages in the United States. So, I mean, that's just the factual data. FHA and VA Setback, they have that fee simple ownership, they have all those things, but instead of 200 feet, they went 300 feet setback. Not 200 feet, 300 feet. Now you start talking about what would a 200-foot setback from the residential improvements mean? It would go about 250, it's about 450 by 450, right? If you've got the property in the center, and your improvements, your well, your septic, and you're going 200, 200, 200, 200, let's say this area is 50 foot by 50 foot, you'd be at 450 by 450. The square footage works out to be about 5 acres. If you take this and go 300 feet in each direction, you now have about 650 by 650. Anybody got any idea? I'm a math guy, so. It's just under 10 acres. It's about 9.5 acres. So that'll give you an idea of the setback that's required under the guidelines. Pretty significant. It's not just little pieces. A couple of other things that I gave you in the handout here. And again, I'm here to educate, not to draw conclusions. You draw the conclusion based on the information that you have, factual data. This letter is to Maurice Hinchey, U.S. House of Representatives, and Maurice wrote the Federal Housing Finance Agency and said, tell me, what are the guidelines? And you'll look in here, and in that letter, and you can read it at your own perusal, it talks about that 200-foot setback. It talks about the fact that the lender must meet all the requirements of the guidelines for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, including appraisal issues. We talked about the difficulty of getting an appraisal. Talks about setback, talks about homeowners insurance. So it really leaves that lender with the liability to enforce something that the lender really doesn't want to enforce, but we're put in that place to do that. There's a couple of newspaper articles about Nationwide and the gas and the insurance coverage or lack of insurance coverage for gas-related issues. The last 2 pages, and I copied these front to back, or somebody did, I think. Maybe they didn't. I don't know. There's a page right out of the S-Guys, and it's chart 8.3, and it lists several states: Arkansas, Colorado, Louisiana, New Mexico, Ohio, Pennsylvania, the city of Fort Worth and Wyoming, and it lists what those areas have in statutory setback for any gas drilling operations. And I look at this, and I go down through and say Arkansas 200 feet, Louisiana 500 feet, New Mexico 300 feet, Ohio 100 like New York, Pennsylvania 200 feet, city of Fort Worth 600 feet, Wyoming 350 feet. So you can start seeing that some research has been done on what the setback is in other parts of the country. Even the S-Guys had some of that. I actually did a little bit more research. And the research that I did was I did an internet search. And I put a little chart together on the back of several other setbacks from other municipalities. This took me about an hour. But I was able to find, and I'll just fly through this, Montana wasn't listed, Wyoming 350, Kansas 265, Vermont 600. And then there's a whole bunch in Texas. Texas was interesting because each town set some of their own setbacks. Austin, Texas 500, Westlake, Texas 1,000, Bedford, Texas 500, and on and on and on and on. Okay? So that'll give you some idea. In my opinion, we need to start thinking about setback if we're going to think about gas drilling. Folks, my time is up. They've been flashing the 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute for a couple of minutes now. I believe we're taking a short break here. We've got some refreshments in the back and some handouts, and they'll be circulating cards around for questions. Thanks.